I was on duty and Master at Arms Shack in Naval Hospital on the U.S. Naval Air Station, Corpus Christi. And when the announcement came out, I was on the way from the office to lunch, and I passed by a door where a bunch of the crew was listening to a radio, and were just learning of the attack on Pearl Harbor at the time. I had been in about, I don't know how long I'd been in. I'd been in long enough that I had asked for a Christmas leave to come home, and it was approved, but I didn't get it. It was canceled. I guess I was excited. I can't remember exactly. Wondering what was going to happen next and how long it would be before. We were already shipping out a lot of our crew for emergency reasons that were coming up around the naval world. And so the next thought, I guess, was when and where I would go.
And of course, I wasn't in the service at that time. I was a head nurse at National Carbon Company, and it was right outside of Clarksburg, West Virginia. Armour is what they call it. And of course, we were defense industry. And even though our hospital had a hospital unit that went in the Army, I wasn't allowed to go because I was in the. They said I had to stay where I was more useful then, where I stayed, and I didn't go in until 41. And of course, I had always been, after I graduated from nurses training, I had joined the Navy Reserve at the Red Cross, and then I asked that I wanted to come in, and they sent me to Bethesda, Maryland for my physicals and everything. And then I got my orders on, it was in early fall, and I had to go to Portsmouth, Virginia. The indoctrination of the eastern coast was done there, and we had everybody that came from New York to Florida, all up and down that coast, and that's where we had our indoctrination for 2 weeks. And in my class, quite a few went different places, but I stayed in Portsmouth, and I stayed in the barracks at the Navy Yard until they had a room for me in the nursing home at on the naval base at Portsmouth. And then I was a PRN nurse for a while, and I remembered you got to do different things. And one night I was given 2 corpsmen and told to open up a ward. They were bringing in a bunch of sailors with, as they called it, cat fever, and which was more or less like a real bad cold. They all were sick, and we had to set up for them. And then after that, before I went in before they sent me to Washington, D.C., I supervised from 10 to 14 wards on the waterfront there on the Navy base, and I really the corpsman did the work, but I had to be sure that I checked the wards every day and walked quite a bit. I enjoyed it, and then from there I went on. I only went to the 2 places, to Portsmouth and to Washington, D.C.
Well, of course, it was unbelievable that anyone would have pulled such a sneak attack as the Japanese had done at Pearl Harbor, and of course, at that time, most of the National Guard had already been mobilized, and then recruitment began on mammoth scale, and of course there were many who came up with what we call flag fever. And even though the draft was going to get a lot of us sooner or later, millions, I guess, at least hundreds of thousands, got this flag fever and went ahead and joined up with whatever branch of service they preferred, and went on active duty, which is what I did do, because I believe at the time I could have been, being a pharmacist, I could have been deferred, but as I said, the National Guard had been mobilized and had taken all the young people out of here that I really felt like I knew. Many of them I grew up with, played with, ran around with, went to school with, and so I yielded to my flag fever and joined the Navy. Well, the first thing I did each morning when I went there, I should say, I guess, that before I left South Pacific, we were all given choices of our duty station, and all the ship's crew got first choice of duty station except me. And I got Washington, D.C. to my great disappointment, because I just had no idea what it was all about or anything. I had no idea why I was going there and why everybody else was given their choice of duty stations coming from South Pacific. And when I reported for duty, I was immediately given a promotion. Chief pharmacist mate put in charge of the Navy dispensary pharmacy, which was at that time was the largest naval pharmacy that we had. And then in addition to that, and the main reason that I had been brought back from South Pacific to the pharmacy in Washington, D.C. was that I was to be President Roosevelt's personal pharmacist, which I was for the last 15 months that he lived. But the first thing that I did each morning when I got to work, there was a White House courier there with a list of things that might have been needed for the president's office and for the president, and I suppose for his family, I don't know. But I fixed this pouch for him the first thing in the morning, each morning when I went to work, and it was taken to him either there in Washington, D.C. by this courier, or put aboard a Navy plane and flown to wherever he might have been that day. And it continued up until the day he died. I sent him let's see, what was it called? Oh, there was a name for it. It was an order for the president. It had a special name, which I can't recall. And it was sent to him every day of the year, every day that he lived. And then after that, I got with the crew and decided what our situation was for the day. Well, we did most of our manufacturing. We did very little dispensing of the finished product. Nearly everything we dispensed, we made. We manufactured there. For instance, a lot of days in manufacturing liquids with alcohol, I would use 50 to 100 gallons of alcohol a day. And then 100-pound bulk packages of powders and things like that. And supervised that operation for the day, stayed by for calls from the White House or whatever, which I had many times from the one superior officer that I had, who was in the White House, and that was the only one who could question my procedures. And then took care of the sailors, the dependents who came for prescriptions. I had a White House locker, I had the only key to it. And as I said, nobody could question me on it. Now, the precautions were that if we needed 10 drops or a teaspoonful out of a gallon jug, it had to come out of an unsealed package, unsealed bottle, or package, whichever the case might be. And that wee small portion that was needed for that prescription, and then the remainder of that package or bottle had to be destroyed because it president couldn't have anything out of an unopened container. And then just to show you, I think each morning that this courier came, he always came in a station wagon, and that thing would be loaded down with gifts, cakes, drinks, vegetables, watermelons, cantaloupes, anything like that that the pub. And you might remember Hope, Arkansas has sent the president watermelons many times. Well, he never saw that. It was always acknowledged, but that watermelon would have been plugged, they call it. They'd cut a plug out of that watermelon, take it out and analyze it to see that it did not have poisonous substance in there. Everything that was sent or given to him was analyzed like that. But then after it was analyzed and it was all right, they loaded it up and brought it to us out to the Navy Department and maybe someplace else, I don't know.
We were always quite busy. Well, as I said, we had the different departments there. It was just, we had everything there. Eye, ear, nose, and throat, and a surgical wing, OBGYN, and the lads. And most of the time, the desk was always, we had 2 nurses at the desk, and that's where we greeted people and found out where they wanted to go. And it was, and we'd have to take turns, and maybe I'd go back in OBGYN, and I got in trouble one day about that in OBGYN. We just let people sign in, and then they went in to see the doctor, you didn't sit up. And I let Lieutenant J.G.'s wife was gone in front of an admiral's wife, and she put me on report because she was an admiral's wife, and the poor J.G.'s wife felt so bad about it, and they sent her husband out to sea, and they were going to send me, take me out of the Navy Department dispensary, but we had Welton had Captain Wimberly was our executive officer, and he'd been overseas in New Zealand with Welton, and so he stood up for me, and I got reprimanded, but I didn't get sent off. It was, you knew you were at war because there was...
You had to identify them, and then there's autopsies held on.
Always there. And we were also, when I was there, the Navy always looked after us as far as housing. We had a place in Virginia Beach that we could go in, not in uniform, and they had food down there for us. But the only thing, we was restricted, that we didn't talk to them. We could sit and watch the ships going out in convoy, but we never talked, not even to each other watching them go out. And it was really something to see them going out in a group of ships. You see them on movie and everything, but we actually saw them there, and it was something to see and remember. And everything, I feel like now they talk too much. We weren't allowed to talk. And I think it's better, because I think talking too much gives too much away, and we weren't allowed to, they told us not to ever discuss anything, and we didn't.
And a friend and I, we decided that we wanted to join the Air Corps. So we were going to take off and go to Little Rock and join the Air Corps, Beall Warren. And Bill was able, he didn't work, and he was able to take off, and he went to Little Rock and got in the Air Corps. And I was working and was finally able to take off a day, so I hitchhiked to Little Rock, and I went in the recruiting station there, and this recruiting sergeant said, "I'm sorry, there's no openings in the Air Corps. Let me show you some other organizations." So he started showing me the artillery and the infantry and various things, and he got to the engineers, and it showed these engineers with pistols on their side, and they were surveying land and doing things, building bridges and things like that, and that appealed to me. So I said, well, I believe I'll join the engineers, and I did. And I stayed there in Little Rock for about 2 or 3 days, and there's a group of about 10 of us that had joined together. And he said, Mr. Scott, I want to put you in charge, and we're going to send you to California. And so he gave me the papers of these guys and put us on the train. And I thought, my Lord, what have I done? I reported to the sergeant there, and he issued us uniforms, and we stayed there, and he put me to work typing because he found out I could type. And while these other guys were out marching and doing various things, well, I was in there doing typing. We stayed there about 2 weeks, and then they sent us out to Fort Ord, which was just being built at that time. That was in, that was probably in about September 1940. But we went through all the basic training there, took rifle training, bayonet training. I made expert rifleman on the range there when we fired. And let's see, that was on into 41, and I was promoted, got a private first class, and then I was promoted to corporal and assistant squad leader. Let's see, from Fort Ord, we went out to the desert and did desert training on the Mojave Desert and up and down the coast. And we were out on, I believe we were back at Fort Ord one time, and we had just had a meal, and I think it was lunch. And we were sitting around on the barrack steps, just shooting the breeze, and decided what we were going to do, and we were planning on playing a little football. And one of the guys, a couple of guys came running down from the orderly room and said, the Japs at Pearl Harbor, everybody fall out, the Japs have bombed Pearl Harbor. And we thought, where in the world is Pearl Harbor? And all the officers came into camp, and they lined us up out the company street and told us we wanted to get all of our full field packs, get our rifles, our helmets, and this is something we very seldom ever wore except during a march. I mean a hike. Told us we were moving to the back of the camp. And I found out later that everybody was thinking the Japanese were going to be coming in and bombing Fort Ord. So we moved about behind on the reservation, probably about 2 miles out of camp. And we set up our tents out there. We had pup tents, 2 men to a tent. And we set up our machine guns. We had 30 caliber water-cooled machine guns. We set up machine guns out there expecting the Japs to come in and bombing Fort Ord. And we stayed back there probably 3 or 4 days. And they ordered us to go up the coast to reconnoiter the landing sites where the Japanese might come in. So we started at Monroe and went on up the coast to, we stopped at several places, but we ended up in about a week at San Francisco, just across the Golden Gate Bridge, and down to the waterfront. And they had us building barracks for the coast artillery. They were going to move the coast artillery and set up guns, big guns on the coast. And then they loaded us up and we left there and went on up the coast, mapping all the landing sites where the Japanese would have the beaches where they could come in. And we went on up to Oregon, Washington. And while we were in, let me go back and mention something. When we were before Pearl Harbor, when you go into town in Monterey, little children would be playing on the sidewalk, and when they'd see a soldier coming, Mom would say, "You kids, get in the house." And it really bothered me that little children would see a soldier coming and they'd go hide and get away. But apparently, the soldiers had a bad reputation there in Monterey, in certain parts of town. After Pearl Harbor, we were moving up the coast. People, when they saw the Army convoy come in, when we got out to go down to the beach and patrol the beach or something, those civilians couldn't do enough for you, bringing apples and fruit that grew up there, brought you sandwiches, brought us things, and everywhere we went, people would, as soon as you got off the truck, somebody was there giving you something. I thought, man, what a difference a war makes. The war was going on in the desert, in South Africa, in Rommel's thing on the desert over there. So they decided we needed desert training. And they moved the division out to Needles, Arizona. And it was hot and just almost unbearable. And our company commander was a fellow that I don't know where they got him and what kind of commission he had. He must have had some kind of reserve commission. And by the way, through all this process, we're talking about a year and several months, I was promoted to first sergeant. And the company commander, every morning after reveille, he would get his driver, and they'd go into Needles. And his driver told me that he took Lieutenant Heaton to a poker parlor there, and he played poker all day, and they'd come back in the evening late, and we had rumors. I was sending men out on assignment, transferring them out to outfits. And we had several fellows we were fed up with this lieutenant, the way he was acting, and just neglecting his duties. And an order came in for us to transfer a cadre, and a cadre means a group to form another company. This was out there on that desert. It was hot, and the way we were being treated and what we were going through. When I got this order to make up a cadre, I didn't even mention it to the company commander. I went around and talked to the fellows that I thought felt the same way I did, and just about all of them. So I had my choice of who I wanted to go with me. And I picked a man in each one of those positions, asked them if they'd like to be put on a cadre to go out. So I put their names on, and I put this on the company commander's desk when he came in that night, and he signed it. And no question asked. And I took it on to headquarters, which was about 300 or 400 yards away, in another tent, and gave it to the sergeant there. And he turned it over to the major, the battalion commander. And the battalion commander signed it just like it was and sent it back. And we got orders about 3 weeks after that, transferring these men to Mississippi to form a division down there. And every day I left the tent there, orderly room, with the company clerk, and I went out with one of the platoons. And one day I was out with the platoon, and a motorcycle messenger came out and said, "Sergeant, Lieutenant Heaton wants you in the camp right quick." And he said, he let me know that Lieutenant Heaton was really disturbed about something. So I got in the weapons carrier there and went on back to camp, and I could hear him quite a bit before I got there to his tent. And he walked around with his hands drooped down, you know, and the colonel had called him up and told him to get down there right away. And he went down to the colonel, and the colonel jumped all over him, and the colonel had done the same thing. He had signed it without looking at it. And when he saw who was on that cadre, he called Lieutenant Heaton, and when I saw Lieutenant Heaton, he jumped up out of his chair, and he said, "Sergeant, what in so-and-so have you done to me? You got me nailed to the cross. What does it mean to this?" And he held his orders up, you know, and I knew what it was. And I said, "Well, sir, you signed it." And he just made all kind of remarks, you know. He said, "You got me nailed to the cross." You know, he was cussing and raising Cain. And he went to the colonel and tried to get it changed, and the colonel went to division. And the division said, "No, it's already approved. These are orders from the War Department forming this new division." And he'd sent those all the way up, and once that gets that far and approved, you've got so many people that it's got to go through that there's just, you know, there's no change. And we shipped out of New York, and let's see, probably in 1943, we docked in Abbotsbury, England. And I don't believe that's the name of the port, but that's where we ended up, just a few miles from the camp. I guess the first time that we really got into a rough spot was, and I was still the first sergeant at that time, and I was going out with the different squads or different platoons with the company commander's permission. And at one time, the company commander was going out with a platoon to do some road clearing in a forest there. We got out there and unloaded the trucks, had the guys put their bedrolls on the side of the road. There was snow on the ground, and we were going to sweep the road of mines and do some repair to the road. And he and I wanted to. We were going to do a little reconnaissance and look around. And I spotted a deer about 100 yards away. And I said, "Hey, Captain, look at that." And I said, "Man, that would make a good meal." And so he said, "Well, let's get him." He said, "When I say 3, let's both fire." So we did, and both of us shot, and that deer just fell down. And we started hearing tanks up ahead of us, off to the left, toward where that road is going. And he said, "Sergeant, we better check and see what that is." So we had the guys all come down and go into the woods across the field where we were headed. And here came these tanks. And there must have been about 8 or 10 of them that we could see. And they were German tanks. And they stopped at our bedrolls, where our bedrolls were, and where our deer was. And they loaded up our bedrolls and loaded up our deer and headed on in with them. And in about 30 minutes, we heard the most firing and artillery and tanks. And it was getting late in the afternoon and almost nighttime then. And you never heard so much racket in all your life, and artillery was going off. And he said, "Sergeant, we better get the guys and dig in." So we dug our foxholes, and he and I had a foxhole together, and he had the radio and was in touch with the company. I had dreamed that I had found a bunch of baby blankets in a warehouse, and each one of us had gotten one of these, if you remember, those small baby blankets, and each one of us had gotten one and put it in our pack. And I was dreaming that I was in one of those baby blankets, and I was just as warm as I could be. And I felt him kicking me, and he told me later, he said, "You were shaking so that I thought I was going to have to get down there and rub you to keep you warm." And he said, "All of a sudden you got still, and I realized something was wrong." So that's when I felt him kicking me, and I dreamed that I was in one of those baby blankets. Well, he woke me up and made me stand up, and I was shaking, so we stood there and hugged one another for about an hour, and we stayed up all night. And this artillery and tanks firing on the direction they had left us, where we left our guys, and we stayed there all that night, just cold. I mean, I'll never forget how cold it was. And the next day, the firing had moved on farther on down, so he felt like it was safe enough for us to head on back to Elsonbourne, and we got the guys out of their foxhole and we started back. And I imagine there must have been probably about 20 of us, 20 to 25, and we started back. And about a half a mile from where we had spent the night on that thing, we ran into where some of our troops had been, and we were parts of clothing and bodies hanging up in trees where that artillery and those tanks had just gotten guys. And we finally got into the edge of town, and I could see the guys out in the street out there. And one of them I'll never forget was Jimmy Wright. He and I had been together back in 1940 when we joined the Army together at Monroe. And Jimmy came running out, and he grabbed me around the neck, and he said, "Jelly, I'm glad to see you, man. We thought you guys were gone." But they'd gotten word, that the Germans had gone through there, and they had already gone through the edge of this town. And So we got back in there, and then we at that point we had not lost any men. We took turns going back to the mess truck in this little town and getting our Christmas dinner. And I took about 6 or 8 guys, I guess, and we went back. And this going back is with your rifle and crawling through, you know, and being pretty darn careful where you were walking and watching artillery coming in, and this is what we called the bulge at that time. And we went back and we ate, and we were headed back to to release, let some other guys go. And that's when the artillery opened up, German artillery opened up, and we were getting, it explodes overhead, you know. And that's when I was hit in the leg with a piece of shrapnel, but thank goodness it didn't break a bone, and we were able to get on back and relieve other guys. But this was probably the worst time for us, was during the bulge. This thing here says when the smoke cleared, the engineers had killed 400 Jerry's and captured 13 self-propelled guns, and that was that's what they call the hot corner. But that was during the bulge, and we let's see, we went on from the bulge and moved on into Germany, and my division, 99th Division, we understand is the first complete division that crossed the Rhine, and we did not realize how big this was. The 99th Division, we understand, was right in the middle of the bulge, and we did not realize the significance of it. We knew at the time there was a whole lot going on, but we didn't realize how serious it was. And it turned out that was really the turning point of I think it just showed that the Germans could be beat. We lost more men with frostbite than wounded. One of my best friends and the guy that we were together all the time was a Sergeant Kahn. He was a Jew, and you can imagine the problems that he went through as a Jew that I'd never even thought about because I just couldn't imagine anybody being mistreated like a lot of the Jews were. But Kahn had gone through this, the taunting from people, you know. But he and I became very close. We were together probably all together about 4 years. And I'll never forget when we were in the foxholes there during the bulge. Kahn had his platoon up there, and they had 3 machine guns. And Kahn was going, we had the machine gun ammunition dump behind us about 100 yards. And Kahn was, during all this firing, he was going, at night time, he was going back and forth, carrying probably about 3 or 4 ammunition boxes, and they were heavy. And I'll never forget, I can see him now, going back and forth carrying ammunition to his 3 machine guns. And he had on the combat boots like I had on, and he came down with frostbite so severe that we sent him, he went back to the States, and they were planning on amputating one of his feet, and they sent Kahn to a military hospital, and they cut off several toes, but they did not amputate his feet. And I did not see him again until a reunion, and I believe it was in Pittsburgh. And I heard when I got there that Sergeant Conn was there, and I saw him kind of limping down the hallway. And he saw me and he said, "Stop." And I stopped and he saluted me. And he said, "I've been waiting all these years to salute you." And that's the first time we'd seen one another since the bulge. And of course, we were always good friends. And he made 2 or 3 reunions and then he died. But of course, we became very close to a lot of guys, like that we went together. I was with some of them for 3 or 4 years, and you don't forget people like that, Everybody pulling together, pulling for one cause, one goal, and I think that's true of family. I hope and pray that my grandkids that when they see me, I hope and pray that they'll have respect and good thoughts about how I've lived my life. And I think that's the main thing, and I think it's lacking a lot of times in some things that I see. I think a lot of times that people are forgetting that loyalty and consideration for one another, and it worries me sometimes. But then I just hope and pray that that everything will work out. That we'll have well, I see news of the servicemen and women right now that they appear to me to be carrying on like we'd expect and hope they would.
Well, we had, you might say the first boot camp we had would have been Fort Devens, Massachusetts. And one of the interesting things was that when we were federalized and went there they took us there by bus. It was about 150 miles from my home. But when we got there, they had a snowstorm, and they had over 1 foot of snow. And the buses couldn't even enter. At that time, the snowplows were not working well, and we literally had to get off at the gate and walk to our barracks, which was maybe about a mile from the gate. And we learned how to be soldiers. At that time, we had the firing range, and we had some non-commissioned officers. At that time I was a private first class, so I was told when to get up and when to go to bed, and most of our training at that time was to become an infantry officer and be able to fire. We had lots of firing exercises, and then about 6 months after that, they moved my unit. It wasn't a very big unit, but they moved it up to Maine, way up right on the coast, and our job was to maintain approximately 100 miles of coastline, looking for any possible German submarines, because at that time we were afraid that Germany would. We had lots of boats moving, and we were afraid that the Japanese might come ashore. In fact, we were afraid of them. Really, it was unanticipated, because they never did, of course. Okay, I was a member of this. After I became an officer, I was transferred. I received my first, you might say, my first assignment. I was assigned to the 66th Infantry Division, which at that time was in training at Camp Robinson, Arkansas. They were training to go over, and they did go over to Europe, to England, to help participate in the liberation of Europe. And I, by all, if it were not for an incident or an accident, I would have gone to Europe. But somehow we were training out in the woods. We were doing maneuvers, and I fell. And if I didn't break my leg, it was pretty serious, and I could not walk. So I was in the hospital, and so they transferred me out of the 66th Division in order that I might recuperate from my fracture. And so approximately a month later, when I was able to walk, I received orders to go over to the Asiatic theater rather than going to the England theater. And they put me on a train, on a Rock Island train at Little Rock, Arkansas, and they sent me to San Francisco, an Army base. It was Fort Ord out there. And I was a second lieutenant, and I had no command. And so I stayed at Fort Ord about a month. And then my orders were to report to a ship. We did that. We had to go to another base, and we loaded on board an Army troop ship up at, it was right out of San Francisco. And we didn't know where we were going when we left. I was a second lieutenant, and I had to sleep. I had to sleep in not a cot. We had the old, what do you call them? In other words, not a swing, but a what?
Hammock?
Yeah, a hammock, yeah. And we left, of course, everything was done in secrecy. We didn't know where we were going, what the destination was, and we were on, I think we were on that ship 21 days before we finally came to our port. And the one thing I remembered about New Caledonia was that there was a big leper colony there on that island. This was run by the French. The French had settled there. And I was amazed to see these lepers walking around. We stayed there about, I would say about a month until we were transferred to another ship. And then we went nonstop up to Leyte. The battle was already in progress at Leyte. There were other units fighting there, but I was assigned to the 7th Infantry Division, the 17th Regiment. And when I joined the unit, here I was, a young second lieutenant, about 22 years old, and I was sent to command a infantry platoon. I had 3 rifle squads. I'll take that back. I had 3 rifle squads and a heavy light machine gun squad and a mortar squad. And I had approximately 30 men who had already seen battle, because these men had already fought at Kwajalein, which was another island we had taken from the Japanese prior to the Philippine island. Well, I remember that one of my first, when we were in Leyte, we were assigned a battleground, it was a sort of a tremendously, it wasn't a mountain, but it was a high place. We knew the Japanese were up at the top, and I was ordered by my company commander to take a platoon and to go up and find them, and if possible, eradicate them or kill them. Well, anyway, I took, and it was about half a mile up the hill. And so I spread out my men, and in the infantry you don't bunch up, or you're not touching other. At the very most we spread out, go 5 yards between men, and we started up the hill. And we got almost to the top when we received a lot of heavy fire from the Japs. They were up there, and and our mission was to clean them out if we could, but if we couldn't, just to find their location and come back, and they would put the artillery on them. So I lost a couple of men that day, I saw no need in trying to go further up there, and so I ordered my men by signal to withdraw down the hill. So we did that. That was my actual very first battle I was ever in. We knew what the next orders were. We were told that we were going to invade Okinawa, which was the next, it was the closest island to Japan itself. I think it was about 400 miles from Japan, and we were going to invade Okinawa, and we did. We jumped off approximately in April of 1945. Let's see, yeah, 45, and and my unit was loaded on an LST. That's one of the boats that can go up, and it would carry about 3 tanks and probably about 50 or 100 soldiers. And we were told that we were going to land on Okinawa in the first wave, and believe it or not, we landed on Easter Sunday in 1945 at about 6 o'clock in the morning. They had the Navy had prepared the beaches and had literally fired thousands of rounds at the beaches, thinking that the Japanese might be there to oppose the landing. But fortunately, the Japanese did not choose to fight us on the beaches. They knew we had to turn north. North is where many of the soldiers were. We landed about the middle of the island. There was about 50 miles north and maybe about 30 miles south. The south was the center of activity because the Japanese had a big airfield there named Kadena, Kadena, and that was our mission, to take Kadena. And what we did is the first day, the day that we landed, we crossed the island, and then I think there were two Army divisions, and there was one Marine division was going north. The 2 Army divisions were going south. We were going to Kadena. Our mission was to annihilate the Japanese and to take over the airport so we could begin using it. And that's where our heaviest fighting was. We received a great because we had to cross, in the first place, the first obstacle, we had to cross a field which looked like it was about a mile, maybe a mile wide. It was completely flat with no trees, very little cover, and then we would arrive at the base of some mountains. Well, the Japanese had in place their cannons and their big artillery there, and so when the one thing I do remember that they sent some Sherman tanks across this field going toward the Japanese to try to wipe out whatever Japanese they could find. There were Japanese in foxholes around there. But I do remember that, and then later on, as the 7th Division, my men and I were ordered to advance. And I do remember seeing about 21 of our tanks that had been knocked out by the Japanese artillery because they were traversing a completely open field with no cover, and the artillery, the Japanese artillery, was in place in caves over there. So we were, it's just like you're going toward the base of a mountain with no cover. You're going to be murdered by the soldiers they had good cover, they had concealment, and we literally had to go up there to wipe them out and on hand-to-hand combat. Well, I think approximately, I think it was April the 16th when I was wounded. That in 1945, we were advancing in a field, and some mortar shells come into our platoon area, and I was sustained some mortar fragments in both legs, and so of course I knew I was hit at that particular time. Each unit, each company had one first aid man, and his job was to see to anyone that was wounded, if he could patch them up or treat them for cuts or bruises, or else if they were injured to the extent they needed to be removed, he would take them out of the action and take them to a aid station. Well, I could not walk, so so they took me back to the aid station, and they decided that since the shrapnel had penetrated my leg and was still in the leg, I needed to go to a field hospital. I might mention that when I was both on Okinawa and in the Philippine Island, every night we would dig a foxhole, and we would have 2 men in a foxhole, and one had to remain awake at all time of the night, and the Japanese would come up. They didn't get any of ours, but they would try to infiltrate and be quiet, and then just before they got to a foxhole, then they would give their banzai yell. Sometimes it didn't occur to me or my man, but it did on some of the other units of my company. They're literally courageous. They had no no worry about dying. They knew they were dying for their emperor, and so they were they just would come up and commit suicide if they had to. But we would fire. If they came up, I would hear firing quite often. I just never actually had hand-to-hand combat with a Japanese soldier, but I know some of my men who did. Well, I might make this mention that before I went overseas, I met my wife to be, Carlis, and I gave her an engagement ring, and we did not marry. I told her if and when I get back, we will marry. Well, when I got in touch with her and told her that I had to be discharged from the service where I had enlisted, which was up in Camp Edwards, Massachusetts. So she said, well, I'll meet you up there. So we landed at Seattle. I might mention that we after the Japanese surrendered, they took my unit, and we were transferred to Korea. They had a complete Japanese army in Korea, and they were in the process of surrendering to us, and they needed some army troops over there to accept the surrender. So I went over there and spent about 3 months in Korea, and then when it was time to go home, they put me on another boat, another troop ship, and I think this one was about 18 days from Korea to Seattle, Washington is where I landed in the America. And we were going to go by train all the way across the country, and that took us about 8 days because they didn't give us any priority. At that time we were coming home, and but we were so happy to be home and to know we're going home that we just enjoyed it. And my wife met me in Massachusetts. We stayed maybe a couple weeks with my mother, and then we came back to Arkansas, where we married on December the 9th of 1945.
My name is Dan Roy Carter. I was born in Benton, Arkansas, 1917. Well, when I was a teenager, I was beginning to be aware more of it because I knew I was going to be called up for draft, and we didn't think too much about it till a lot of the boys were called up and served in the service, and I was called up and spent time in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, in basic, and then I was sent to Camp Beauregard, Louisiana, in a bridge building company, and after then, I was in there about a year. Well, I transferred into the Air Force for pilot training, and I went through pilot training, and there was a demand for troop carrier pilots, and that's where I landed flying troop carrier planes. Training wasn't too hard. I'm talking about just ordinary training, basic training, stuff like that. But in pilot training, why, you start out with a small plane, and it wasn't too hard to take off and land, and then I was put into transport C-47s, twin-engine plane. You went through about three trainees, primary, basic, and advanced, and you had a different instructor at each place, see, and you'd be at a different field. Well, that was a big day for everybody, see, and of course you went up with a trained pilot and he was just checking you out, see, and he'd tell you to do this and do that and land, and if you did anything wrong, well, he'd correct you on it. And you were a little bit nervous every time when you first flying with the trainer that way. And but that flying, I flew a C-47, which was the old two engine transport that's still flying today. Well, I was in, I had been drafted in I was in transition, basic training. And seemed like everything tightened up in the country on like security and everything like that. You'd see that right after the first one, you'd see guys at some of these cities, and most of them you'd see at bridges and places that they might sabotage. I was in Europe, and I flew in some of the countries over there that was at war, and we dropped supplies all over Europe, and most of the supplies were dropped at night, and there's just plain drops like blankets, stuff like that. The others had parachutes on them, and we had drop zones with certain signals. We wouldn't drop unless they had the right signal. And there was people put signaling in the area, you see lights everywhere trying to get you to drop supplies on them. See, we were briefed on every mission, and on the dangers that you might see, like the some troops out there, enemy, that might be shooting at them. We flew without lights, and you just had to watch out for the fellow behind you. You know, we took all about 10-minute intervals, and we'd have certain signals at the drop zone that they'd have to have so many lights there before you drop on, like the 10 lights on the ground, different lights, and a lot of times we'd drop and the package would drop on the light, put the light out. Well, we'd have to wait a few minutes before they put it back, because we might be in the wrong place, and they were just putting out lights, and they did several times. You'd run over a bunch of lights there that wasn't just right, like we'd have a count of 7 or 9, and once in a while we'd put one of the lights out with a parachute, see, when they hit the ground, and you'd have to wait till they either put it back or take off, and not fool around if they didn't put it back. And but there would be a lot of times there would be people knowing that maybe there'd be 12, 15 planes that come over one at a time, one right behind the other, and there'd be people putting out lights all around there. See, we'd have a prearranged signal, like 10 lights in the shape of an A, or different shapes. Nearly every trip we went out, you had to watch out for lights that didn't belong there, see. And once in a while, they'd try to shoot at you, but we were lucky they never hit us or anything. Mostly shotguns, I think. Pilot, co-pilot, engineer, and navigator. And one guy that took care of the dropping of the packages and sometimes we'd drop one package with it was parachuting. They'd kick those out first, and once in a while one of it hang up on the tail section, and then you was in trouble. You had to try to zigzag some to get it off the tail section. Like a bag of something. I flew about 31. Ones I was, and we'd have 12 planes that was going out, and they'd take off different intervals, like about 10 minutes intervals, and then you had to watch out with the drop zone, because one of them might be slower than the other and catch up with you. See, I've experienced people shooting at me with small arms, but not any flak. But I passed over one little house one night, and I looked down, and the guy come running out there and with a shotgun, I guess, but he was shooting at me, and he wasn't anywhere close.
Just a German citizen?
No, this is in Yugoslavia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we were dropping in Yugoslavia, and well, you'd see a bunch of sheep out there or something like that, and you'd dive down, and they'd just go every which way, see. And every once in a while, you'd see that farmer come out there and with a shotgun, and that's when we took off. See, of course, we got up in the air pretty quick, so he couldn't hit us. But and we never talked about that around the base, because that was forbidden. But there's always somebody, one or two of them that actually hit a tree or something, but they got back all right, and they said, "Oh, somebody was shooting at me." See, we always we know about an English camp there, and then they'd be out there bathed in the ocean, and we'd drop down and wave at them, and you really had to watch when you was fooling around looking at women. Some of them wouldn't have very much clothes on, see. I trained in gliders.
No,
When you take off and you get in the air, well, you're following that plane that's pulling you, see. And then whenever they cut you loose, well, you're on your own, and you better land pretty quick, see. And of course, they usually cut you loose at open field. They didn't have to have a very big field. And but I don't think I didn't have too much thinking about the gliders, because I wasn't just pull them all I did, but those boys in that glider now, that's something else, you know. Whenever they cut you loose, well, I actually rode that glider, see. Well, it just gets solid, just like it's stopped almost, see. And you hear the wind rushing as you go down, and I didn't have to ride one but 2 or 3 times, and that was all I needed. I didn't want to be a glider pilot. We had to fly gliders, know how to fly them. I didn't have to haul anybody around in gliders, but I had to take off with gliders and cut them loose, and that was interesting. When you cut that glider loose, your plane just picked up speed, see. But it was a funny feeling the first time you took off, because that glider held you back some, and I don't know what the glider pilots thought about it, but I guess they was trained for it. You're towing a glider, well, it's like you're pulling somebody in the car. Somebody had a car broke down and you was pulling it. Well, this glider was slowing you down some, see. And you always like to have good weather, no updrafts or downdrafts, and those glider pilots, well, when they cut them loose, they've got to have a place to land. And once in a while, well, the rope, it'll come loose from his plane, see, and your plane will pick up speed. You know he's loose, see. Oh yeah, we dropped paratroopers and supplies. Most of the time we were dropping supplies over Yugoslavia, but paratroopers, boy, they get out of that plane in a hurry, see. Some of them are more or less pros. They like to jump out, but a lot of them, they push them out. The first time that way. I know several times when we'd just have an open field, and they wouldn't have 2 or 3 runways, and the wind had changed. You'd come in a strong wind, and it'd be a crosswind. It'd just be a runway, not a runway, but a field out there, see. And you really had to watch yourself get it down, and they hold the wind, get down one way, and you get on the ground and bounce it around there. But it was, that seemed like to me was a hard thing to do, to land in a crosswind in an open field, see. A lot of times, like on these crosswind landings, well, sometimes you say, if I ever get this down, I'm not going to get back in another one. But he did. When we were resupplying the troops over in Yugoslavia, I looked down several times, and you see lights go out on the houses. And one night I saw a guy come outside and looked down, and he had a rifle, and he was shooting at me, see. And of course, he couldn't see me, and all he could do was hear me. And I thought, well, I hope he's not a good shot. But I actually see him, come out there with that rifle. And the co-pilot, well, he kind of moved over a little bit. But I think weather was one of the worst things that we got into flying at night. You'd be out there 6 or 7 hours, and you could run into a storm, something like that, and I tell you, when you get into thunderstorm, something like that, well, you're in trouble. You see it coming, well, you better get down low. See, I didn't have many chances like that. But, then flying over water, the first time you fly over the ocean, well, you get out there and there's nothing but water. You can't see land or anything. You get to think, well, something happened to me. My engines take out, something like that. And that's a funny feeling. The first time you get out there and you can't see land on the ocean, well, the important part is being free. You know, it's a lot of places there that you're not really free. And being in the United States, well, that means a lot to you, because a lot of places, you don't run around like we do here, run around in cars and have a good time. And